A clean and safe country with some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. A paradise that was once an immigrant's dream. Today, it's a country that even its own citizens are thinking of leaving. I'm talking about Canada. How is it that in Canada, one of the richest countries in the world, the average citizen can no longer afford to own a home in their own country? How is it that a country known as one of the most livable countries in the world has turned into a place where people are planning to flee? If you've noticed the rise of Get Out of Canada hashtags on social media in recent years, it's no coincidence. According to a survey conducted in 2022, 40% of Canadians now find living in their country unsustainable. This video explains how modern Canada is in crisis and why this once attractive country has become unlivable, even for its own citizens. As you watch this content, if you see similarities between economic pressures in your own country and those in Canada, please share your thoughts in the comments, because these problems are not unique to Canada. They could be part of a global shift. In the 1970s and 80s, being a Canadian citizen was a truly unique privilege. Imagine that the average Canadian could buy a house worth about 3 times their annual salary. Today, in some cities, this ratio is as high as 15 times. At that time, it was possible to support a family on a single salary. University graduates could pay off their school debts in a few years. The health system was functioning smoothly, and grocery shopping was a reasonable part of the family budget. The Canadian identity was also very clear at the time: tolerance, diversity, security, and prosperity. A leading economy with natural resources, manufacturing, and technology. A strong middle class and equal opportunity were among Canada's core values. In an old Canadian magazine, it was written, "A country with all the opportunities of the United States, but without its excesses." These words perfectly summarize how Canada was once seen: a more balanced society with the dynamism of America, but without its social polarization and inequalities. So how did this country become an unsustainable place for many of its citizens? To understand this trajectory, let's look back to the watershed year of 2015. That year saw major changes in Canadian politics and laid the foundations for many of today's problems. When Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, it seemed like the beginning of a new dawn in Canada, promising to solve many of the problems that plagued the country. But 9 years later, these problems only seem to have intensified, as living in Canada gets harder every year. Since 2015, Canada's GDP has grown by 17%, while house prices have risen by 125%. Over the same period, average wages have risen by just 27%. This gap clearly shows how the average Canadian is falling further and further behind. Canada's biggest problem today is undoubtedly the housing crisis. One of the main reasons for this is that foreign investors are using the Canadian real estate market as an investment vehicle. Capital, especially from China, Hong Kong, and the Middle East, has transformed homes from living spaces into investment vehicles. In some neighborhoods, up to 20% of homes are sitting empty, just waiting to appreciate in value. Walk down a street in Vancouver. You will see gleaming, newly built houses, but no one lives in them. These are known as ghost houses. Properties that have been bought only to appreciate in value and no one lives in them. Second, the Canadian government's immigration policies. In 2021, Canada admitted 405,999 people as permanent immigrants, the highest annual number of immigrants in its history. This immigrant admission rate is the highest among G7 countries. Immigration is in Canada's DNA and a key source of the country's cultural richness. However, successful integration of immigrants requires a corresponding expansion of infrastructure, housing, and services. Canada's infrastructure and housing stock are not adequate to accommodate this rapid population growth. Third, inefficiency and bureaucratic obstacles in the construction sector. It takes an average of 10 years to implement new housing projects, during which time the housing deficit grows exponentially. Consider this comparison. Tokyo builds more than 100,000 new homes a year, compared to just 40,000 in Toronto, a city with a similar population. The permits and bureaucratic processes required to build a building in Toronto take almost 3 times as long as in Tokyo. These 3 factors combined have made homeownership an impossible dream for the average Canadian. For renters, the situation is even worse. Rents can be up to 50% of the average income. This is not just an economic problem. It is a humanitarian crisis. Younger generations are becoming dependent on their parents to be able to buy a house, or worse, they accept that they will never be able to own a home. You don't think this situation is sustainable, do you? The housing crisis is not the only problem. Wages in Canada are falling far behind the rising cost of living. In the 1980s, the average Canadian family could live comfortably on one salary. Today, even two-wage families can barely make ends meet. Over the last 20 years, while staple food prices have increased by 120%, rent by 95%, transportation costs by 80%, average wages have increased by only 47%. This gap is widening every day. The situation for young professionals is even worse. University graduates graduate with an average of 28,000 Canadian dollars in student debt. This further deprives them of financial freedom. Let's hear the story of Emily, a 28-year-old software engineer living in Toronto. She graduated from a good university, works for a prestigious company, and earns 75,000 Canadian dollars a year, well above the Canadian average. But she has 28,000 in student debt, pays $2,200 in rent every month, and still needs financial support from her parents. Home ownership is an unattainable dream for her. Emily's situation is not exceptional. It's the reality for thousands of young Canadians. And it's turning into a demographic crisis. Canadian couples are delaying having children or giving up altogether. Canada's birth rate is at an all-time low, 1.4 children per woman. The rate needed to replenish the population is 2.1. But isn't the Canadian economy growing, you might ask? It is growing, but the benefits of this growth are not evenly distributed. From 2000 to 2020, the Canadian economy grew by 43%, but almost 90% of that growth went to the richest 1%. The real income of the average Canadian family barely increased. Another indicator of this imbalance is corporate profits. Over the last 10 years, profits at Canada's largest corporations have increased by 75%, while employee salaries have increased by only 15%. This shows that the gap between rich and poor is widening. On another issue, Canada is world-renowned for its universal healthcare system, but in recent years, this system has also been in crisis. Waiting times in hospitals have increased. The number of doctors has become insufficient, and the quality of service has declined. The average waiting time in emergency rooms can be up to 4 hours. It has become normal to wait 6 months for an appointment with a specialist doctor. About 5 million people in Canada do not have a regular family doctor. The education system is struggling with similar problems. Canadian schools are consistently falling in math and science among OECD countries. Class sizes have increased. Teacher salaries have fallen in real terms, and the physical infrastructure of schools is inadequate. One of the main problems facing the Canadian economy is the lack of diversification. The economy is heavily dependent on natural resource extraction, especially oil and gas. This makes it vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices. In 2014, the collapse in oil prices severely affected Alberta's economy, and thousands of people lost their jobs. Such crises demonstrate the fragility of an economy dependent on natural resources. Canada is also lagging behind in manufacturing. From 20% of GDP in the 1980s, manufacturing now accounts for only 10%. Manufacturing jobs have shifted to low-cost countries and have been replaced by low-wage service sector jobs. In innovation and entrepreneurship, Canada is also falling short of its potential. Canadian entrepreneurs often emigrate to the US for better opportunities. Successful Canadian startups are often acquired by American companies when they grow. This brain drain hinders the country's long-term economic growth. I may have painted a dark picture, but there is room for hope. Canada's problems are complex, but not unsolvable. First, urgent and bold policies are needed to address the housing crisis. Loosening zoning regulations and increasing density in urban centers, increasing the empty house tax and foreign buyer taxes to discourage speculative purchases. Some steps need to be taken, such as increasing public investment in affordable housing projects and reducing bureaucratic hurdles in the construction process. According to economists, to achieve a soft landing in Toronto, housing prices would need to fall by 20–30%. This may be difficult for existing homeowners, but is necessary to stabilize the market in the long run. In cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where the housing crisis is at its worst, Zoning laws need to be drastically changed. In particular, opening up areas zoned as single-family home zones to multifamily development could rapidly increase the supply of housing. Japan's Tokyo model can be taken as an example in this regard. By allowing mixed-use and high-density development along the city center, Tokyo has been able to keep housing prices stable despite population growth. Tougher measures should also be taken to curb housing speculation. Not only foreign investors, but also domestic speculators are part of the problem. A progressive tax on the sale of houses within 5 years of the initial purchase could reduce the view of houses as an investment vehicle. Second, Canada must reduce its dependence on natural resources and invest in innovative sectors. Focus on future sectors such as artificial intelligence, clean energy, and biotechnology. Strengthen the entrepreneurial ecosystem and encourage the growth of domestic companies. Revitalize the manufacturing sector and increase economic independence. Strengthen university-industry cooperation. Montreal's success in artificial intelligence can be a model for the whole country. The government should ensure that Canadian companies can compete in the global market through tax incentives and direct investments in strategic sectors. Clean energy technologies, in particular, are an area where Canada is in a strong position and can lead. Canada needs more support for entrepreneurs to stop the brain drain. Compared to the US, Canada has more limited venture capital funding and more bureaucratic hurdles. Removing these barriers and paving the way for local companies to grow would increase economic diversification. Concrete steps should be taken to close the gap between corporate profits and employee salaries. Instead of tax regulations that incentivize retention of profits, tax advantages could be offered to companies that pay higher wages to employees. Canada's immigration policies should be aligned with the country's infrastructure capacity. Set the annual number of immigrants in line with housing supply and infrastructure capacity. Encourage immigrants to settle in areas outside major cities. Better assess immigrants' skills and accelerate integration. Immigration is vital to Canada's economic growth and cultural richness. However, it is clear that the country's infrastructure and housing stock are not in a position to accommodate this rapid population growth. Immigration quotas need to be synchronized with the pace of housing construction and infrastructure investment. The problems facing Canada are too deep and structural to be solved in one election cycle. Therefore, a national strategy that focuses on long-term solutions needs to be developed in a non-partisan manner. An all-party roadmap should be drawn, especially on the housing crisis and economic diversification. Citizens should be more actively involved in decision-making processes. Strengthening local governments, expanding popular assemblies, and using digital democracy tools can help citizens make their voices heard more effectively. Restrictions on corporate political donations should be increased and political financing made more transparent. Develop policies that prioritize the needs of the average citizen over the interests of large corporations. In conclusion, Canada remains one of the most beautiful and potentially livable countries in the world. It is a unique country with spectacular nature, cultural diversity, democratic traditions, and a peaceful society. Let us not forget that throughout its history, Canada has overcome adversity and emerged stronger each time. This time will be no different, as long as we dare to take the right steps. The Economic Facts channel provides content about economic crises, financial collapses, and macroeconomic imbalances in countries around the world. Our aim is to present the deep problems of the global economy, failed development models, and political mistakes in simple but effective language. We examine all aspects of how economic systems collapse, from China's slowing manufacturing power, Germany's industrial contraction, Japan's chronic stagnation, Britain's economic stalemate, Turkey's inflation spiral, Argentina's debt crises, and Venezuela's hyperinflation. Behind every bankruptcy lie deep political, social, and structural realities, not just numbers. Subscribe and be the first to discover the dark side of the world economy.